The moon landing is remembered as one of humanity's brightest moments, but the technology that made it possible was born in underground tunnels where thousands died building a weapon of vengeance. And scientists behind this weapon went on to shape the entire space race. This is the dark origin of the rockets that took us to the moon. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Man, I really wanted him to go with number 2. Oh well. What the... Are they ghosts? We died in the dark so you could walk in the light. You're welcome. So there we are on the moon, planting flags, snapping selfies with Earth behind us. Humanity has landed rovers on Mars, peered into galaxies with James Webb, but behind the glory is a darker truth. Space exploration was built on sacrifice, secrecy, and science twisted by war. Behold, the wind canoe! This fires compressed air to knock enemy bombers from the sky. So, it works on pigeons, at least. So this is Newton's third law, the golden rule of motion. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. By the way, this is a real weapon invented by Germans, the wind cannon, and you can see how well it works. Send some puff of wind up and get rolled down by the cannon. That's it. That's rockets. It's hot gases blasting down through a nozzle, and the rocket itself gets shoved upward. And here's the part that puzzled early scientists. How would it work in a vacuum in space where there is no air? But the exhaust gases themselves are what the rocket is pushing against. Mass goes one way, rockets go the other. And so, the Germans decided they wanted in on Newton's little rule too. There were nerd clubs like Verein für Raumschiffahrt, meaning Society for Space Travel, which launched tiny little liquid fuel rockets into air from Berlin fields. Nobody thought these tin cans with flames would ever amount to much beyond singed eyebrows and disappointed parents. But the military was paying attention. After World War I, Germany had been slapped with a mountain of restrictions, and the Treaty of Versailles hit especially hard. Then Hitler rose to power, and they kept looking for loopholes in the treaty as heavy artillery, tanks, long-range weapons were all banned. So rockets were not mentioned in the treaty. You couldn't build massive guns, but nothing stopped you from building something that wasn't technically a gun. Suddenly, rocket science wasn't about reaching the stars anymore. It was about bending the rules. Overnight, the nerd hobby turned into state business. By 1932, funding started flowing quietly under the label of research. That's when a young engineering student, Werner von Braun, dreaming of space travel, and artillery officer Walter Dornberger, armed with military contracts, were paired up. One had the brains, the other, the budget. Together, they laid the groundwork for the secret rocket base on Germany's Baltic coast. Construction began in 1936, and by 1937, the place was running at full capacity. Thousands of engineers, scientists, and eventually forced laborers filled its halls. Von Braun still fantasized about rockets to Mars, but Hitler only saw wonder weapons that could terrorize the Allies. The dream of space had been twisted into the machinery of war. In 1942, the V-2, Vengeance Weapon 2, was officially commissioned. Hitler loved it because he was obsessed with psychological terror. He didn't want a weapon you could see coming. He wanted something that screamed through the edge of space, broke the sound barrier, and cratered a city before anyone even realized what was happening. The V-2 was exactly that. To get the V-2 working, Nazi engineers had to tackle problems that had haunted rocket nerds since they strapped fire to a tube. This wasn't model rockets in a field anymore. This was the world's first true long-range ballistic missile. The fuel used was ethanol and liquid oxygen. Oxygen is what lets stuff burn, but the thin air around us doesn't cut it when you're trying to hurl 13 tons of steel skyward. The fix? Liquefy oxygen at cryogenic temperatures, pump it into tanks, and shove it straight into the combustion chamber. Mix that with alcohol under pressure, and we get a jet of fire blasting out at 2,000 meters per second, enough thrust to fling a 14-meter spear nearly 190 kilometers into the sky. All that power came with a death sentence for the engine itself. The combustion chamber ran so hot it could melt through its own skin in seconds. The German solution was weirdly elegant. They ran unburned alcohol around the chamber walls to cool them, then fed it into the fire. Regenerative cooling. A design born out of war that still powers rockets today, from Atlas to SpaceX. Day 34, lucky day to finally balance the broom. Wingardium Leviosa. Steady, steady. Oh, my nose! Well, at least I can be Dark Lord. So balancing the broomstick with magic, that's rocketry. You Muggle-borns try to balance the broom in your finger. Except this broomstick was 14 meters tall, weighed 13 tons, and screamed through the sky at Mach 4. That's the speed of sound into 4. Stability came from gyroscopes, spinning wheels that fought against motion. They sensed wobble and sent corrections to actuators, which nudged graphite vanes shoved directly into the rocket's exhaust flame. Once the rocket gained speed, aerodynamic fins at the base took over, keeping it flying like a supersonic arrow. But gyros alone weren't enough. The rocket needed a brain. No, not that brain. Rockets don't need a hollow pumpkin shell. They used Mishkarat, which means mixing device, but in practice the first analog computer for missiles. Inside that box of gears and vacuum tubes, Newton's laws were being crunched in real time. Gyroscope data, accelerometers, preset trajectories, all mashed together to keep the V-2 vaguely pointed where it was supposed to go. And the shape made all the difference. That shark-like body, the conical nose, 4 fins for stability, it sliced through the sound barrier, reaching as high as 189 kilometers. For context, the internationally recognized boundary of space, the Kármán line, is just 100 kilometers up. That means Nazi Germany, in the mid-1940s, had already touched the edge of space. Which is the bitter irony. The first human-made object to cross the Kármán line wasn't sent to explore the unknown. It was sent to kill. You come back right here. I need space. Respect my boundaries. You're grounded, young man, and don't forget I am your boundaries. The V-2 wasn't orbital. Ballistic flight and orbital flight go hand in hand, but not the same. A ballistic trajectory means you go up, gravity grabs you, and you come right back. Orbital flight, on the other hand, requires enough horizontal velocity to keep falling around the Earth without ever hitting it. That magic number? About 7.8 kilometers per second, or Mach 23. The V-2 only reached around 1.6 kilometers per second. So while the V-2 could never claw its way into orbit, the real gravity was the human cost that dragged it down. And the cost of this? Unspeakable. After Allied bombing raids destroyed Peenemünde, the rocket base, in 1943, production was forced underground into Moria. Nope, I mean the Harz Mountains, at a site called Middelwerk. 20 kilometers of tunnels were gouged into the rock, damp, choking with dust, lit only by bare bulbs. So, this rocket is like one rocket to rule them all. More like one rocket to bury us in these tunnels.
My wishes.
But Russian winter remains the true ruler. Prisoners from the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp were pushed into 12-hour shifts, starving, beaten, and executed if they collapsed. They weren't treated as people, only as expendable machine parts. In the end, around 20,000 died building the V-2. Roughly 9,000 lives were lost to the weapon's strikes on London, Antwerp, and Paris. More died making the weapon than from the weapon itself. The V-2 wasn't born in sleek laboratories, it was built in hell. Such a nice guy. Definitely not an Adolf's bestie. When the US was bringing German scientists over after World War II, their files often had negative notes like Nazi Party member or SS officer. To fast-track the ones America wanted, mainly rocket and weapons experts, officials would attach a paperclip to the scientist's personnel file. So the whole program to recruit them became nicknamed Operation Paperclip. The Americans launched Operation Paperclip. Over 1,600 engineers, technicians, and scientists were shipped across the Atlantic. Records were sanitized, resumes rewritten, and suddenly you had former SS officers moving into white picket fence neighborhoods. The most famous of them? Wernher von Braun. Von Braun was the chief architect of the V-2. He wore the SS uniform, held the rank of Sturmbannführer, and personally toured the Mittelwerk tunnels where prisoners were being worked to death. Later, he would insist he was apolitical, just a dreamer who wanted space. History doesn't buy it. Instead of trials, von Braun and his team were quietly cleaned up and given new roles. At White Sands in New Mexico, they began firing captured V-2s for the US Army. These weren't just tests for the military. They carried instruments, reached the edge of space, and in 1946 took the first photographs of Earth from high altitude. The first weather data above the stratosphere came from retooled Nazi rockets. Step by step, the old V-2 team became the backbone of NASA. By the 1960s, von Braun wasn't in a courtroom. He was running NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, leading the design of the Saturn V, the very rocket that would take humanity to the moon. The Soviets weren't sitting idle. They dismantled entire German factories and moved them east, and brought about 2,000 German scientists into the USSR, including Helmut Grottrup, von Braun's deputy. But unlike America, they kept their Germans on a short leash, then sent most back after a few years. Even so, the knowledge transfer jump-started their own program, and from it emerged Sergei Korolev, the chief designer. not German, but Soviet. He was a Soviet engineer who had survived Stalin's gulags and re-emerged as the father of Soviet rocketry. With German data in one hand and his own brilliance in the other, Korolev created the R-7, the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile. Finally, it's the time to crack the Russian doll. Behold the true Soviet fuel source. R-7 is the first intercontinental ballistic missile and the launcher of Sputnik in 1957, as well as Yuri Gagarin in 1961. The rockets look totally different. New paint job, bigger engines, shinier buttons. But peel back all those layers of Cold War propaganda, and both family trees go right back to Peenemünde and the V-2 missile, Nazi rocket science. Now let's break down the scale of that evolution. The V-2 in the 1940s, 14 meters tall, 13 tons, tossed a 1-ton warhead about 300 kilometers. Scary, but nowhere near orbit. 2 decades later, the Saturn V, 110 meters, 2,800 tons, blasting 7.5 million pounds of thrust. It could haul 140 tons to orbit, 50 tons to the moon, roughly 400 times the payload of a V-2. Both burned fuel plus liquid oxygen. Both wrestled with unstable combustion, insane turbopumps, and cooling channels. The V-2 had gyros, feedback loops, and analog computers. The Saturn V's instrument unit, a ring-shaped brain weighing 2 tons and packed with gyroscopes, accelerometers, and early digital circuitry, could deliver astronauts to the moon with pinpoint accuracy. Even aerodynamics carried over. The V-2 was one of the first human-made objects to break the sound barrier in powered flight. The data it provided, nose cone shapes, control fin performance, shockwave behavior, fed directly into Cold War missile design and ultimately into spacecraft re-entry dynamics. Different scale, same skeleton. Here's the moral kicker. Werner von Braun, once an SS officer walking through slave tunnels, was now America's space poster boy beside JFK. To the world, he was Apollo's hero, but every rivet of Saturn V traced back to a weapon of terror. Turns out the truth was darker than any conspiracy theory ever dreamed of. That's the paradox. Apollo was humanity's brightest light. We walked on another world. But its roots lay in war and exploitation. The moon plaque said, "We came in peace for all mankind," carried there by a rocket born from violence. The landing wasn't just triumph, it was a reckoning. A redemption arc written with ink from history's darkest pages. If you enjoyed this video, watch this video on the discoveries we ignored, even though they had changed the world. And that's all for today. Thanks for watching.